we studied what a constitution is. We also studied the need of the constitution. Now we need to know what are the forms of constitution. A constitution may be of various forms. It could be written, like the Indian constitution. Many countries have an unwritten constitution, but an unwritten constitution is not possible to be in a large country. Small Greek city-states used to have unwritten constitution or single document constitution. There are constitutions which have multiple document constitutions also. That means for every rule of the country, for every principle of the country, they may have a different constitution, a different book for it. India has a single constitution. There's just one book which talks about everything in our country. Constitution is created by, like we just spoke about it in the previous video, that the dictator of the country makes the constitution, the monarch of the country makes the constitution. Similarly, if it is a military rule, the military people will make the constitution. Such kind of constitutions can become defunct. Defunct means which will not function properly. India needed a constitution which would survive throughout and which would not become defunct. That is why it chose for a written constitution and a single document which would cover all that is required to rule the country. And so it is important to know how effective the constitution is. Our next topic in the textbook is effectiveness of constitution. The first point in it is mode of promulgation. Promulgation means announcement. How was the constitution announced? What was it based on? How did we decide that this is what we are going to put in the constitution? Who did it? So first thing that comes into our mind is creation of constitution. It was important that we have good people who create or who write our constitution, who make a constitution which becomes successful. Second thing was the history had to be kept in mind. India has a rich history and culture. The Britishers had ruled over us. Before that, there were many other people who ruled over the country from different parts of the world. This history had to be incorporated into our constitution. People had to know what kind of trouble, what kind of turmoil the country has gone through and how it has come out of it successfully. Leaders. We needed charismatic leaders who would form the constitution positively, who would give their best and create a good, awesome constitution for the country. Referendum. What do you understand by referendum? Referendum means voting. In India, we did not have to send the constitution for voting. The people themselves were involved in the constitution. And that is why the constitution came out positive, keeping in mind the outlook of the people. Second point is substantive provisions. Substantive provisions means essential clause. It was important to instill faith. People had to believe the constitution. They should know that what is being told in the constitution is for their good. It is for their welfare. If any group feels their identity is being stifled means suppressed, their voice is not being heard, they will have no reason why to abide with the constitution. For them to abide with the constitution, it is essential to instill faith. It was important to convince people that it provides a framework for pursuing basic justice. The more a constitution preserves the freedom and equality of all its members, the more likely it is to succeed. Third point is balanced design, balanced institutional design. The makers of the constitution knew that there would be a number of institutions to run a country, like our executive, legislature and judiciary. And so it was important to maintain a check and balance. It was important to see that all these three organizations or all these three institutions run independent of each other. It was important to create a constitution where no single group can subvert. Subvert means go against the constitution. That there cannot be a monopoly of any institution. So it was important to establish all institutions independently with their own rules and regulations, not dependent on each other. And that is how we have our executive, legislature, judiciary, election commission, and so on and so forth. Constitution is, whether is it rigid or flexible? What is rigid? Rigid is something which cannot be changed, which cannot be altered. And flexible is something which is changeable, which can be altered, where changes can be made. We could have kept our constitution rigid and seen to it that no changes are made in the constitution at all. Or we could have kept it flexible and kept changing it at every step. Neither of these type of constitutions would have been successful. So it was important to maintain a balance between rigidity and flexibility. So there were many provisions in the constitution which were kept rigid, that is, which cannot be changed. Like the fundamental rights of the constitution. You cannot remove them, you cannot amend them. And there were many which were maintained flexible, so that as the country progresses, as the country grows, we can bring about changes. Like we have made some changes in the religious part of our constitution also, and in many other inequality, etc. we have brought in some changes. All these things you will study in further chapters in your textbook. Another thing is living document. Our constitution is living. Why do we call it a living document? Because it talks about today. Even though the constitution was framed right after independence, still, whatever was written in the constitution in 1950, you can find that it holds true even today in 2020. That is why our constitution is called a living document. It lives with the times. The next topic in our book is making of constitution. How was our constitution framed? Formation of Constituent Assembly. For making of the constitution, it was essential to have a Constituent Assembly. Not everybody and anybody could have come to make a constitution. And so, a Constituent Assembly was formed via the Cabinet Mission Plan. A Cabinet Mission Plan told us who would be the members of the Constituent Assembly, how would this Constituent Assembly work, and from what aspects will they make their rules and regulations. Our country, India, like I have told you in before also, is a huge country. We have many people living here. When we got independent, when the constitution was being made, our country was divided into princely states. Princely states are those places where the kings used to rule. So our constitution in the Cabinet Mission Plan, they decided that each province and each princely state were allotted seats proportional to their respective population. As a result, the provinces that were under direct British rule were to elect 292 members, while the princely states elected 93 seats. In that way, we got 385 members. And then the seats in each province were divided according to religion also. The Cabinet Mission Plan also kept in mind that each community in the Provisional Legislative Assembly elected their own representatives by a method of proportional representation. The details of all these things what I have told you will come further as you keep studying your subject, political science. Selection of members was also important. The right type of members had to be elected so that they would make a proper Constituent Assembly. So it was from the leaders of the country like Jawaharlal Nehru, Rajendra Prasad, B.R. Ambedkar, all these kind of people were made a part of the Constituent Assembly. They were learned men who had been part of the freedom struggle, and they knew exactly what could be the best for their country. Composition of Constituent Assembly. Aftermath of partition. You all must have heard a lot about partition. You must have read about it in your previous classes. You've seen movies related to partition. So one thing that you all know about the partition is that once the country was divided into India and Pakistan, many people who were a part of the Indian Constituent Assembly, who were a part of the Indian government, had to leave the country and move away to Pakistan. More so, the country was divided, and so many parts, many princely states, many states which were previously a part of India had to be cut off and given off to Pakistan. Because of which the members of the Constituent Assembly were changed. The ones who were members of the Constituent Assembly had to be sent to Pakistan, because of which the number of members in Indian Constituent Assembly decreased, and it was reduced to 299. 26 November 1949 was a very important day in our history. It was on this day that the Constitution was adopted. We decided that we have to make a constitution. On 24th January 1950, the members, all these members of the Constituent Assembly, they signed on the document, they gave their signatures on the document as a final constitution document. And it was on 26 January 1950 that our constitution came into force. Does this date ring a bell? Yes, it does. 26 January is our Republic Day. So now you know, we celebrate our Republic Day on 26 January because our constitution came into force. It was applied on the countrymen on 26 January 1950. One thing that was important was that the Constituent Assembly committed the Constitution to a new conception of citizenship, which would not only secure the minorities, but also not have religious identity as a bearing on citizenship rights. So anybody who is a citizen, because we had just got partitioned, there were people who had walked into India from Pakistan, and so it was important to give them some respect and also give them an identity. And that is why this new concept of citizenship was developed, wherein anybody who wanted to be a citizen of India was most welcome, irrespective of their religion and irrespective of their minority status. That is how our constitution was framed and came into being. Who were the members of the Constituent Assembly? How were they elected? We cannot name all the members of the Constituent Assembly, but we can know how were they chosen. Well, they were not elected by universal suffrage. You know what universal suffrage is? Universal suffrage is everybody who is adult, who is above the age of 18, or at that time it was 21, was allowed to vote. So the members of the Constituent Assembly were not elected by universal suffrage. But it was those people who had worked in the freedom struggle who were given an opportunity to be a part of the Constituent Assembly. Religious representation was also done, where members of all religions were given representation. Not a single religion was left out. Yes, this is important. There was domination of the Congress. Why? Because the Congress dominated as many as 82% of the seats in the Assembly after the partition. Congress was one of the biggest parties of that time. It was in fact the only party of that time which worked in getting us our freedom. And so it played a vital role in the Constituent Assembly. It was a diverse party that managed to accommodate almost all shades of opinions within it. And so the Constituent Assembly did see domination of the Congress. Our next topic is principle of deliberation. Children, you need to know that the authority of the Constituent Assembly does not come only from the fact that it was broadly representative. It comes from the procedures it adopted to frame the constitution and the values its members brought to the deliberations. What is deliberations? Deliberations are discussions. So our constitution was framed with a lot of discussions. It was not that one person recommended a particular principle and everybody just signed on it. No, they were healthy discussions. And these healthy discussions did not, let me tell you, they did not turn into a fight. They remained positive discussions. They brought in a lot of values into the constitution. They also discussed in brief, in detail, everything about the procedures which have to be adopted. And because they represented each and every person in the country, it was a very representative constituent assembly. There were often disagreements amongst members, but few of these disagreements could be traced to members protecting their own interests. So it was not for themselves that these members were framing the constitution, but they were framing it for the people of the country. Almost all the principles that were adopted the procedures that were adopted were discussed, and they went through each and every point of that particular procedure. But there was one such point which did not need a discussion, and that was universal suffrage, where it was being discussed that how will elections take place, who will be allowed to vote. It was unanimously decided that anybody who is of a particular age in the country will be allowed to vote, irrespective of his gender, of his caste, of his religion, etc., etc. And so, universal suffrage or universal adult franchise was one such point which did not need any kind of discussion. Next topic which we need to understand is public reason. What is public reason? The members of the assembly placed a great emphasis on discussions and reasoned argument. I have already told you this. They did not simply advance their own interest, but gave principled reasons to other members for their positions. That why are they not following a particular provision, or why do they want some changes in that provision, that was nicely discussed and presented in front of the committee. That was public reason, the mode of discussion and debate which brought forward all the loopholes in a point and which gave a sense of knowledge to all the people. What were the procedures which were followed by the Constituent Assembly? This is very important to know, that what kind of procedures the Constituent Assembly followed. When the Constituent Assembly was working on making the Constitution, it was working for almost 166 days, which was spread over 2 years and 11 months. That is the time it took to frame our Constitution. There were 8 major committees which were formed. These committees were on various subjects, on different subjects, and they were headed by stalwarts like Jawaharlal Nehru, Sardar Patel, our very own Iron Man, Rajendra Prasad, who became the President of India, and Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the father of the Constitution. He was the one who was responsible for framing the Constitution. These were not mere men who agreed with each other on many things and also disagreed with each other on many things. Ambedkar had been a critic of Gandhiji and also of Congress, but still, as a part of the Constitution, they all worked together without any kind of differences between each other. So that is how our Constituent Assembly worked very hard to frame our Constitution. Usually, an attempt was made to reach a consensus with the belief that the provisions agreed to by all would not be detrimental to any particular interest. And these people saw that the provisions were subject to vote. And every single argument, query or concern was responded to with great care and also in writing, so that later Nobody could point out at any flaw or oppose the Constitution. An assembly as diverse as the Constituent Assembly of India could not have functioned if there was no background consensus. Background consensus means if we wouldn't have seen what was our history, what was behind us. The Constituent Assembly was giving concrete shape to forms and principles which had been forged during freedom struggle. A rich history was researched and the historical background was also presented in our Constitution. The principles of the Constitution, like I said, were based on the freedom struggle, the difficulties that we saw, the poverty, lack of education, the problem of caste system in India, the problem of class system in India, racism in India. All these things had to be kept in mind when the Constitution was being framed. All these things had to be removed from India. We had to make India equal, free from all kind of biases, and that is why such kind of principles was forged. The major point that was kept in mind was the objective resolution. The objective resolution was moved by Nehru in 1946. It summarizes the principles of the Constitution. It is based on these principles given by the objective resolution that the Constitution was able to take its own principles. The objective resolution gave expression to terms like equality, liberty. Liberty is freedom from all kind of difficulties for the people. Sovereignty, that is the country has its own identity. Democracy, the form of government that we adopted. And cosmopolitan identity to the people. Everybody was considered equal and everybody was given a cosmopolitan identity known as Indians to the people of the country. The main points of your objective resolution have been given in your textbook. You have to just turn to page number 20 and you will find the objective resolutions given there. They are an important part of our Constitution and so it's necessary that you read them and you know more about them. The Constitutional Assembly spent a lot of time in involving the right balance among the various institutions like the executive, the legislature and the judiciary. While evolving the most balanced governmental arrangements, the makers of a constitution did not hesitate to learn from experiments and experiences of various other countries. When they found anything good and applicable to India, they adopted it and borrowed a number of provisions from different countries. Borrowing was not a slavish imitation. It was just a way that they could also make a constitution which was applicable to India. Each provision of the constitution had to be defended on the grounds that it was suited to Indian problems and aspirations. The British Constitution was the most important example in front of us. And from the British Constitution, the Indian Constitution makers picked up FPTP system, that is the first past the post system, a system of elections. Second, they picked up was a parliamentary form of government where the parliament would rule. Third, they picked up was rule of law, that the judiciary or law would be the highest command of the country. They also picked up the institution about the speaker. They also picked up the lawmaking procedure, all from the British Parliament. The fundamental rights which we have in our constitution and the concept of judicial review, that is we can ask for a review of our judicial statements, was picked up from the United States. From the Irish Constitution, we picked up DPOSP, that is Directive Principles of State Policy. Those are some directives which are given to states that they have to work for the benefit of its citizens. The Canadian Constitution gave us quasi-federalism. Quasi-federalism is a system where the government is a federal system with a strong central government. It also gave us residual powers. Residual powers, you will learn about it in the coming chapters. There are three kinds of powers: state powers, union powers and residual powers. This was also come to us from the Canadian system. The French gave us principles of liberty, equality and fraternity. These three words, these three principles made place into our preamble. Preamble, the first page of our constitution, which is like a summary to our constitution. So this was the various constitutions, these are the various constitutions from which our constitution borrowed the most important of the provisions so that our constitution could be rich and could meet all the requirements which the country needed. Thank you.